The morning sun rose slowly over the city, painting the streets in a pale golden light as the cadet made his way toward the gates of the police academy. He carried with him nothing more than a duffel bag filled with the basics, a beating heart that carried equal parts fear and determination, and the dream that one day he would wear the badge of honor that he had admired since childhood. To him, this was more than training, more than discipline, more than law, it was purpose. But as he walked past the tall iron gates and saw the looming buildings that stood behind them, cold and gray against the rising sky, a strange chill slid down his spine. It was as if the academy itself was alive, watching, waiting, and silently judging the new recruits who dared to step inside. He shook it off, convincing himself it was only nerves, but deep down something already felt wrong, though he could not name it. The first sound that greeted him was the whistle of an instructor, sharp and loud, cutting through the air like a blade. The other cadets who had arrived earlier stood in neat rows, their bags at their feet, eyes forward, faces tense. Some looked excited, others nervous, but all of them wore the same mask of determination. He quickly joined them, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers who, like him, had no idea what awaited them. The instructor walked up and down the rows, his boots striking the ground with military precision, his eyes cold and unblinking as they scanned each recruit as if measuring their worth without a word. Finally, he stopped, blowing the whistle once more, and barked orders so strict and rapid that the cadet felt a shiver ripple through him. There was no welcome speech, no words of encouragement, no handshake to remind them they were on the path of honor. Instead, it was discipline, control, and silence. From that very first moment, he knew this place was not like the stories he had heard, not like the training montages he had imagined as a child. This was something else. That night, after the endless drills, the shouting, the sweat and exhaustion that left every muscle burning, the cadet finally lay down in the dormitory bunks with the others. The room was dimly lit, lined with rows of metal frames and thin mattresses, the smell of iron and damp fabric filling the air. He closed his eyes, letting exhaustion pull him toward sleep, when suddenly he heard a whisper from the bed beside him. A fellow recruit muttered something about the rules, something about how they were stricter here than at any academy he had ever heard of. "You don't ask questions," the voice said, almost too quiet to catch. "You follow orders, or you vanish." The cadet opened his eyes, confused, but before he could reply, silence filled the room again. He waited, listening, but the recruit never spoke again. By morning, the bed next to his was empty. The cadet asked another trainee if he had seen where that recruit went, but the boy only frowned and shook his head, muttering something about reassignment. The instructors, when asked, simply barked at him to stay focused and never waste time worrying about others. That was when he first noticed the unspoken rule of the academy. When someone was gone, you didn't talk about it. You didn't ask where they went. You didn't ask why their things were still lying there, untouched as if they had only stepped out for a moment. You just trained, obeyed, and kept your mouth shut. But for him, silence was not so easy. His curiosity was sharp and his instinct screamed that something was wrong. And the deeper he buried that feeling, the stronger it clawed its way back to the surface. The days that followed blended together in a haze of drills, commands, and silence. From the moment the cadets woke to the piercing sound of the morning whistle to the late hours when the lights finally dimmed, their lives were reduced to obedience. Every step was monitored, every mistake punished, every hesitation questioned. The cadet learned quickly that this was not the kind of academy that trained you with encouragement and teamwork. It was a place that broke you down, stripped away individuality, and demanded absolute control. Still, he told himself this was part of becoming strong, part of becoming an officer worthy of the badge. But deep inside, the unease grew, tightening around him like invisible chains. One night, as he lay in his bunk, he heard faint footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, almost dragging, like someone didn't want to be heard. He sat up slightly, holding his breath, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The dorm door creaked open and a shadow slipped inside. It wasn't an instructor. He could tell by the hesitation in the figure's steps. It was another cadet. The figure moved quietly toward a bed at the far end of the room, leaning down as if whispering something to its occupant. The cadet strained to hear, but the words were too low. Then, just as suddenly, the shadow slipped back out into the hallway, leaving behind an unsettling silence. By morning, the bed that Cadet had visited was empty. Sheets still in place, boots still at the foot of the bed. Another one gone without explanation, and once again no one spoke of it. Training intensified in the following weeks. The instructors grew harsher, their punishments more severe, their watchful eyes colder with every passing day. The cadet noticed how certain recruits began to change, not just physically from exhaustion and pain, but mentally. Their eyes dulled, their voices grew quieter, and soon they stopped talking altogether. It was as if something inside them had been taken, leaving behind hollow shells who only knew how to follow commands. He swore to himself he would not become like that he would keep asking questions even if only in his mind. But the more he noticed, the more dangerous it felt. The academy was not just training them, it was consuming them. One afternoon, after an especially brutal endurance drill that left half the cadets vomiting in the dirt, he caught sight of something unusual. At the far end of the training field, beyond the high fence topped with barbed wire, a black van was parked. Two instructors stood by it, speaking in low voices. Between them, a recruit was being led toward the van, head bowed, wrists bound behind his back. The cadet froze, pretending to tie his bootlace as he watched. The van doors opened. The recruit was shoved inside, and within seconds the van rolled away, disappearing behind the tall academy walls. When he tried to point it out to another cadet later, the boy only shook his head violently, eyes wide with fear, and muttered, "Don't ever talk about what you see." That night he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the image of the recruit being forced into the van, the instructor's cold expressions, the unspoken terror in the other cadet's eyes. He wanted to believe there was an explanation, that maybe the recruit had broken some serious law or was being transferred elsewhere, but nothing about it felt right. And the more he tried to rationalize it, the more he realized the truth. People weren't just leaving. They were being taken. The academy lights shut off at midnight, leaving the dorm in complete darkness except for the faint glow of the moon through the high windows. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when a voice whispered from the bunk below him, "You see it too, don't you?" It was the quiet, shaking voice of another cadet he had barely spoken to. He hesitated, then whispered back, "See what?" A pause. Then the words, "This place isn't what it seems." "They're not training us. They're choosing us." The voice trembled, and the sound of suppressed sobs followed. Before he could ask anything more, the voice went silent again. He leaned over the bunk to look, but the cadet below had pulled the thin blanket over his head, refusing to speak another word. The next morning, that bed was empty. The academy at night was a different world. By day, it was filled with the echo of whistles, the bark of orders, and the heavy rhythm of boots on concrete. But when the lights dimmed and the halls emptied, the silence pressed against the walls like something alive. It was the kind of silence that made every creak of a floorboard sound like a shout, the kind that wrapped itself around you until you felt it sitting on your chest. The cadet lay in his bunk, pretending to sleep like the rest, waiting for the steady rhythm of breathing to fill the room. He had been planning this for days, ever since he noticed the locked door at the end of the administration hallway, a door marked, "Records, Authorized Personnel Only." Instructors carried keys. Recruits never went near it, and yet the cadet's gut told him that if there were answers to the disappearances, to the missing cadets whose beds went empty overnight, they would be found behind that door. When the clock struck midnight and the last patrol of instructors passed the dorms, he slipped silently out of bed. He had timed it perfectly, 30 minutes before they circled back. Dressed in plain training clothes, he moved through the shadows of the dorm, careful not to wake anyone. His heart pounded so loud he feared it might give him away. He slipped into the hallway, the cold tiles biting against his bare feet, and crept toward the far end where the administration offices loomed like dark sentinels. The corridor leading to the records room was darker than the rest, as if even the lights didn't dare to shine there. The cadet kept to the walls, every sense alert, every nerve stretched thin. When he finally reached the door, he knelt beside it, examining the lock. It wasn't an electronic keypad, just an old-fashioned deadbolt, but sturdy. He had no key. For a moment, panic gripped him. Had he come this far only to fail? Then he remembered a trick he had learned back home, something his uncle, a locksmith, had once shown him as a game. Using a thin piece of wire he had smuggled in from the workshop, he worked the lock slowly, carefully, his fingers trembling with every click. The silence of the hallway made each sound deafening, and then with a final twist, the lock gave way with a soft snap. The cadet froze, listening. Nothing, no footsteps, no shouts. Just silence. Swallowing hard, he pushed the door open and slipped inside. The room smelled of dust and old paper. Rows of filing cabinets stretched into the darkness, their metallic surfaces reflecting the faint moonlight from a small, high window. A desk sat at the center, littered with folders, scattered notes, and an old typewriter that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. He closed the door behind him gently and flicked on a small desk lamp, its dim light spilling across the room like a fragile secret. His eyes scanned the labels on the cabinets: admissions, evaluations, dismissals. That word caught his attention. Dismissals. He pulled the drawer open, the metal screeching softly, and began to flip through the files. Each folder carried the name of a cadet. He recognized some of them, faces he had seen in the dorms, names he had heard during roll call. But these files didn't list reasons like injury or voluntary withdrawal. Instead, each one was stamped in red, dismissed. Underneath, vague notes like unsuitable, failure to adapt, or disciplinary removal. Yet none of it matched what he remembered. These cadets hadn't seemed weak or disobedient. They had just vanished. He read further. Attached to some of the files were letters supposedly sent to families, polite but cold explanations that their sons or daughters had failed to complete the program and were no longer part of the academy. But there was something odd. The signatures at the bottom of each letter were identical, as if stamped, not written. And the dates didn't match the days the cadets had disappeared. Some letters were dated weeks earlier than the actual vanishings. His stomach churned as he flipped faster through the papers, sweat dripping down his forehead. The truth was staring him in the face. These weren't dismissals. These were cover-ups. Someone was removing recruits from the academy, erasing their existence and feeding lies to their families. Then he found something worse, a section of files marked with a black tab. Unlike the others, these weren't stamped dismissed. Instead, they were marked classified. He opened one and his blood ran cold. Inside were photographs of cadets strapped to chairs in dimly lit rooms, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. Some had wires attached to their heads, others had bruises across their bodies. Attached reports described resilience testing, psychological endurance trials, and subject responses under duress. These weren't training exercises. These were experiments. His hands shook as he shoved the papers back into the folder, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. Then a sound froze him in place, the faint creak of a floorboard just outside the door. The cadet's pulse thundered in his ears as he froze by the desk, one hand still clutching the classified folder. The faint creak came again, closer this time, and then silence. He quickly switched off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. His eyes darted to the small window near the ceiling, too high to reach, too narrow to escape through. That left only one option: hide. Moving quickly but as quietly as possible, he slid between two filing cabinets, pressing his back against the cold metal and forcing himself to breathe shallowly. The door handle rattled. He clenched his jaw, every muscle tightening. Slowly, the door creaked open, spilling a thin shaft of light from the hallway into the darkened room. Heavy boots stepped inside, pausing as though their owner was listening. The cadet didn't dare move. He didn't dare blink. The boots moved farther in, the faint scrape of leather against tile echoing in the stillness. Whoever it was didn't turn on the lamp. That was strange. An instructor would have flipped the switch immediately. No, this was different. It was almost as if the person was searching in the dark, already knowing exactly where everything was. The cadet's heart pounded so violently, he thought the sound alone might give him away. He could feel sweat dripping down his back, sliding along his skin in icy trails. The figure stopped near the very cabinet he had opened, the one labeled dismissals. Papers rustled softly, drawers clicked shut. Then a pause. For a long, agonizing moment, the boots didn't move at all. It was as if the figure was listening, sensing something out of place. Finally, after what felt like hours, the boots retreated. The door creaked open wider, then shut with a heavy thud. Silence returned. The cadet didn't move for several minutes. He forced himself to stay pressed against the filing cabinet, counting his breaths until he was certain the figure was gone. Only then did he creep out of his hiding place, his legs shaking so badly he nearly collapsed. He knew he didn't have much time before someone came back. Whoever had entered might realize something was missing. He slipped the classified file back into the drawer. But before closing it, he tore out one photograph and one page of notes. folding them tightly and stuffing them into his boot. He needed proof. Without it, his words would be dismissed as paranoia. He closed the drawer gently, reset the desk as best he could, and slipped back out into the hallway. The silence there felt heavier now, suffocating. Every shadow seemed alive, every corner hiding eyes that followed his movements. He kept to the walls, retracing his steps, and finally slipped back into the dormitory. Most of the cadets were still asleep, their breaths deep and even. He climbed into his bunk, pulling the blanket over himself, clutching the hidden papers in his boot like a lifeline. But sleep never came. His mind was a storm of questions and fear. Who had been in that room? How many people knew about the files? And most of all, what had really happened to the missing cadets? The next day, training was even harsher. The instructors seemed more watchful, their eyes sharper, their punishments quicker. During a grueling obstacle course, the cadet caught sight of one instructor staring directly at him, expression unreadable, as if daring him to crack. Did they know? Did they already suspect him? His stomach twisted, but he forced himself to keep moving, to act normal. He couldn't afford to draw attention. Not now. That night, when the dorm was quiet again, he unfolded the stolen page beneath his blanket, using the faint light from the moon outside. The document was clinical, cold, filled with terms he barely understood. Phase 2 resistance conditioning, subject breakdown analysis, neurological endurance. But one line stood out, written in bold black ink. Subject terminated after failure to comply. Terminated. His chest tightened. They weren't just dismissing cadets, they were killing them. The photograph was worse. It showed a cadet no older than himself, strapped to a chair with a metal device clamped around his head. His eyes were wide, mouth open in what looked like a scream, though the photo captured no sound. On the wall behind him, a shadow of a figure loomed, tall, faceless in the grainy image. The cadet had to look away, bile rising in his throat. He shoved the photo back into his boot, forcing himself to breathe. But as he lay there, the silence of the dorm thick around him, he realized something horrifying. If these files were true, if these experiments were real, then every cadet who had vanished hadn't just left, they had been taken. And if he wasn't careful, he would be next. The days at the academy had already begun to blur into one long stretch of exhaustion, bruises and unspoken dread. But there was one cadet the young recruit couldn't help but notice. He was quiet, always keeping to himself, never volunteering answers, never speaking unless spoken to. His eyes darted constantly as though measuring every shadow, every corner, every instructor's stare. He wasn't weak. He completed drills, endured punishments, followed commands. But there was something fragile in the way his shoulders hunched, something haunted in the way he avoided eye contact. It was as if he already knew something the rest of them didn't. For days, the cadet watched him from a distance, curiosity gnawing at him. While others formed groups and whispered in corners when the instructors weren't looking, this boy sat alone. During meals, he ate quickly and silently, as if afraid to linger. At night, when the dorm was filled with the heavy breathing of exhausted bodies, the boy lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling with eyes that refused to close. Finally, one evening after another grueling day of training, the cadet found himself sitting beside him in the mess hall. The boy barely glanced up, but the recruit forced a smile. "Rough day, huh?" he whispered. For a long moment, there was no response. Then the boy gave the faintest nod, eyes fixed on his tray. Encouraged, the cadet tried again. "Name's Daniel," he lied, using a common name to protect himself, though that wasn't really his. He didn't know why. Maybe some instinct told him names were dangerous here. "What about you?" The boy's lips barely moved. "Ethan." His voice was soft, almost broken. After that, they didn't talk much, but a quiet bond began to form. They ran drills together, partnered during exercises, and shared brief, hushed words when they were certain no instructor was near. Ethan never said much, but Daniel noticed how his eyes flickered whenever someone disappeared, how his hands trembled slightly when the whistles blew at night, how his breath caught whenever the instructors grew too close. One night, long after lights out, when the dorm was wrapped in silence and the shadows pressed against the walls, Daniel felt a gentle tug at his blanket. He rolled over and found Ethan crouched beside his bed, eyes wide, face pale in the faint moonlight streaming through the windows. "You need to stop," Ethan whispered so quietly Daniel could barely hear. Stop what? Daniel whispered back, his pulse quickening, looking, asking. Ethan's voice shook, his hands clenching and unclenching nervously. They watch everything. They know when someone's curious. That's why people disappear. Not because they failed. Not because they quit. Because they asked. His words came fast in a desperate rush, as if he had been holding them inside for too long. Daniel swallowed hard. Ethan, what do you mean? What's happening to them? But Ethan's head jerked toward the door as if he'd heard something. His face drained of color. He leaned in so close Daniel could feel his breath on his ear. Don't ask too many questions or you'll disappear too. Before Daniel could say another word, Ethan scrambled back to his bunk, pulling the thin blanket over his head. Daniel lay awake the rest of the night, the warning echoing in his skull, each word pounding like a drumbeat. Don't ask. Don't ask. Don't ask. By morning, Ethan's bunk was empty. At first, Daniel thought maybe he had overslept, that Ethan had already gone to drills. But as the hours dragged on, and as they moved from obstacle courses to firearm practice to brutal endurance runs, Ethan never appeared. No one spoke his name. No one asked. His bed remained neatly made, boots tucked in place as if waiting for him to return. But Daniel knew the truth. He wasn't coming back. That night, Daniel stared at the empty bunk across the room, his chest tight with guilt. He wished he had pressed harder, asked Ethan to explain, demanded answers. But now the silence was permanent. And worse, Ethan's warning had planted a seed of dread that grew with every passing second. Because if Ethan was right, then Daniel was already in danger. He had already seen too much. He had already asked too many questions. The night drill had been going on for hours, longer and harsher than usual, as if the instructors were deliberately pushing the cadets past the edge of exhaustion. Sweat soaked through their uniforms, mud clung to their boots, and the air was thick with the sound of strained breathing and shouted commands. Daniel's body screamed for rest, every muscle aching, but he forced himself to push forward, refusing to show weakness. Weakness here didn't just mean punishment, it meant attention. And attention was dangerous. They were ordered to run laps across the far training field, a section rarely used, where the ground dipped into uneven terrain near the tree line. Most cadets stumbled, too tired to notice anything beyond the dirt beneath their feet. But as Daniel's boot struck the earth, he felt something strange, an odd, hollow vibration beneath the ground, as though there was empty space below. His pace slowed, his eyes scanning the area until he noticed a patch of earth near the far fence. Darker than the rest, disturbed as if it had been recently dug. The whistle blew, snapping him back, and he sprinted to catch up with the others. But the thought gnawed at him. Hollow ground, disturbed earth, something hidden. Hours later, when the drill finally ended and the cadets were herded back toward the dorms, Daniel lagged behind, feigning a twisted ankle. The instructors barked at him to hurry, but once their backs were turned, he slipped away into the shadows of the trees. His heart raced with every step. If he was caught, the punishment would be severe, maybe worse than severe. But curiosity burned hotter than fear. He crept back to the patch of disturbed earth, crouching low. Moonlight spilled across the ground, revealing faint lines that didn't belong to nature. Metal edges just barely peeking through the dirt. A hatch. His breath caught. He brushed the soil away with trembling hands until the handle was visible, cold and rusted beneath his fingers. For a long moment he hesitated. This was madness. Opening it could mean discovery, punishment, or worse. But then he remembered Ethan's terrified eyes, his whispered warning, and the empty bunk that still haunted him. If there were answers, they were down there. With a deep breath he pulled. The hatch groaned softly as it lifted, hinges squealing against years of disuse. A rush of cold, stale air escaped, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something metallic, something that smelled faintly like blood. The darkness below yawned wide, a black mouth waiting to swallow him whole. He lowered himself onto the iron ladder inside, closing the hatch above to hide his trail, and began to climb down. The tunnel was colder than the night air, the stone walls slick with moisture. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly in the distance, mixing with the pounding of his heartbeat. The deeper he descended, the stronger the smell grew, a mixture of rust, mold, and something sharp that made his stomach twist. Finally, his boots touched solid ground. He turned, squinting into the darkness, and saw a faint light flickering at the end of the tunnel. Step by cautious step, He moved toward it, the silence pressing heavy against his ears. The tunnel stretched farther than he expected, winding deeper beneath the academy. As he neared the light, shapes began to form, metal doors set into the walls, each one marked with a number. He passed them slowly, running his fingers across the cold surfaces. Some had scratches on them, long, desperate gouges carved into the steel. His throat tightened. They weren't storage rooms. They were cells. The light grew brighter until he reached an open chamber. His breath caught in his chest. The room was filled with equipment that didn't belong in any training academy. Interrogation chairs bolted to the floor, leather straps dangling from the armrests. Cameras mounted in the corners, their red lights blinking steadily. Metal tables lined with instruments he didn't recognize, wires, clamps, syringes. On one wall hung a series of monitors flickering with static, as though they were once used to record whatever happened in this place. Daniel's knees felt weak. He forced himself forward, eyes darting across the room, until they landed on a stack of folders on a nearby desk. He picked one up, flipping it open. Inside was a photograph of a cadet he recognized, strapped to one of the very chairs in the room. His face was pale, his mouth open in a silent scream, wires attached to his temples. Below the photo was a report. Phase 3 complete. Subject terminated. Daniel dropped the file, bile rising in his throat. His vision blurred, the room spinning. He stumbled back, clenching his fists to keep from collapsing. This was it. This was what had happened to the missing cadets. They hadn't been dismissed. They hadn't been reassigned. They had been brought here, experimented on, and erased. A sudden sound froze him in place, a metallic clang from deeper within the tunnels. He whipped his head toward the noise, heart hammering. Someone else was down here. The night air was colder than ever, sharp against Daniel's skin as he pressed his back against the damp wall of the tunnel, clutching the stolen files so tightly that the paper bent beneath his grip. His pulse thundered in his ears, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts as the weight of the truth settled over him like a suffocating shroud. This wasn't an academy meant to build heroes. It was a machine designed to destroy them, to mold unsuspecting cadets into experiments, disposable bodies for something much darker. He had the proof now, the photographs, the reports, the evidence that no one could deny. But holding the truth was only half the battle. Escaping with it alive would be something else entirely. He could hear footsteps echoing faintly somewhere in the tunnels behind him, deliberate and heavy. The sound of someone who wasn't searching blindly but moving with purpose. Someone new. Someone had realized he was down here. His knuckles whitened around the folders as he forced his shaking legs to move, every step quick and careful. The tunnels stretched endlessly, turning and splitting like a maze carved into the earth, but he couldn't afford hesitation. One wrong turn could lead him into a dead end. And in that silence, he imagined the grip of hands dragging him back into the chamber of straps and syringes. Daniel's thoughts raced as fast as his feet. Who could he trust? Certainly not the instructors, not the officials who pretended everything was normal. Maybe not even the cadet still upstairs. Anyone could be a watchful eye or a planted spy. That realization struck him harder than the cold stone walls, leaving him lonelier than he'd ever felt in his life. The academy hadn't just stolen bodies. It had stolen trust, hope, and the very idea of safety. A faint draft brushed his face, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and night air. An exit. His chest tightened with fragile hope, and he followed the breeze until he found a narrow passage ending in a ladder that climbed upward into darkness. Above, a faint circle of moonlight peeked through the slats of a wooden cover. He shoved the files into his jacket, gripped the ladder, and began to climb, every muscle screaming with exhaustion. His hand slipped against the rusted rungs, but he forced himself upward, whispering silent prayers between gritted teeth. The wooden hatch groaned when he pushed it, but finally it gave way and Daniel pulled himself onto the surface, collapsing onto the grass. The sky above was endless and black, dotted with cold silver stars. For a moment he just lay there, lungs heaving, the fresh air burning like fire in his throat. But peace was short-lived. Shouts echoed from the academy grounds, flashlights cutting through the darkness like searching eyes. They knew. They were already hunting. He staggered to his feet, clinging to the files pressed against his chest, and sprinted toward the tree line. Branches tore at his uniform as he pushed deeper into the woods, each step an act of desperation. Behind him, the academy loomed like a beast, its walls glowing faintly with light, its sirens beginning to wail. He knew they wouldn't stop until they had him. He wasn't just a runaway cadet anymore. He was a threat, a living piece of evidence that could tear their operation apart. His mind spun with the choices before him. If he went to the police, would they even believe him? Or were the police part of this too, already feeding into the machine, covering for it? If he went to the media, he risked being silenced before a single word reached the public. Every option ended with danger, but silence was worse. Silence meant betrayal, not just of Ethan, or the cadets whose faces stared out from the files, but of every life that would be fed into the machine if he didn't stop it. The forest grew denser, branches clawing at his arms and legs, his breath burning in his lungs. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig sent panic through him, but he kept running, driven by the single fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make it out alive. In the distance, faint headlights cut across a lonely road and his heart leapt. Civilization, safety, a chance to vanish into the world outside. But between him and that road were the shadows of figures moving through the trees, their flashlights sweeping methodically across the undergrowth. Daniel dropped low, crouching behind a fallen log, forcing himself to stay perfectly still. The crunch of boots grew louder, beams of light slicing through the darkness just inches from his face. He held his breath, willing his heartbeat to quiet, every second stretching into an eternity. One of the searchers paused, shining their light slowly across the forest floor. The beam lingered on the log, sliding upward, closer, then turned away. The footsteps moved on, fading back into the trees. Only when silence returned did Daniel let out the breath he'd been holding, trembling uncontrollably. He pressed his forehead against the damp wood, biting back the urge to sob. He couldn't break now, not when he was this close. With the last of his strength, he crawled from behind the log and made his way toward the road, staying low, every movement deliberate. The headlights grew brighter, and soon he could see the outline of a car approaching. He stumbled onto the edge of the road, waving frantically, the files clutched tight in his hand. The vehicle slowed, its brakes squealing softly, and for a moment relief surged through him like a wave. But as the car rolled to a stop and the window slid down, Daniel's stomach turned to ice. The driver was wearing the academy's uniform,